to these folks?
No, but that particular unit actually won some awards, both in their company, because it was a multi-division company, and also externally. So they actually got some press out of it. And so they did have, I wouldn't say they had certificates, but they had quite a bit to be proud of, and they got a fair amount of recognition for
Great.
it.
Daron, do you have an example?
Yeah, Rick, I love your key point there of the positive motivation for change. In a rather different context, as I mentioned, I grew up in GE, spent about 15 years there. I was recruited out of GE back in 2000 to run the global train air conditioning business that American Standard owned. It was about a $5 billion business. There was a need for a lot of positive motivation for change there because this business was not growing at all. You can imagine the air conditioning business kind of grows at GDP levels, and this was a very heavily US-centric business. Of the $5 billion, more than $4 billion of sales were based over here. All the production engineers and most of the production facilities, though not all, were both based over here. The mandate that I was given when I came in by the CEO, Fred Poses, was to drive profitable growth. You know, it seems rather simple. You know, come in, you're going to lead a big business, drive profitable growth. Well, hell, why not? I mean, if we grew at 10%, that would be nice, right? But that meant you had to create a business in each 12-month period of $500 million of sales. Well, that was a little overwhelming. Even if you said, all right, we're going to grow at 5%, that means growing $250 million of sales in a 12-month period. So this business, as I said, was, you know, basically not growing here in the US, a big installed base, a little bit of service type business to support. The positive motivation for change that Rick was referring to was that we really had no penetration in the Middle East and very, very little penetration in Asia. And when we looked at those markets and the growth that they were experiencing, we all read in the press, you know, cast your minds back to the year 2000. China was booming. The Middle East was beginning to grow. Abu Dhabi was investing very heavily. Qatar was investing very heavily, as was Saudi Arabia. However, all our resources were concentrated here in the US. Maybe one of the reasons that I was selected to run this business was not just the fact that I'd come out of General Electric, but the fact that I didn't really come from this part of the world. I originated out of South Africa and had spent the early part of my career in education over there. But clearly the motivation for change was to shift the center of gravity outside of the US to where the markets were available for growth. Asia, China, Shanghai, and in the case of the Middle East, we established our business in Abu Dhabi. And the motivation for change here was, instead of the production engineers here in the US designing product for US consumption, where there was 0 to 1% growth, we had the production engineers designing product over here for growth in the Middle East and growth in Asia. And the market demand there required a very different product set. And so the motivation for those people to change was the fact that if I did good designs, really understood customer needs in those geographies, I'd be able to retain my job. Eventually, we also located a design center in Pudong, just outside of Shanghai. For the sales engineers over here, their motivation was to work with the large US engineering companies, construction companies, architecture firms, many of whom were our clients, but many of whom were doing work in Asia and the Middle East, and help link these individuals with their sales counterparts and the execution arms of their businesses in those geographies. So the motivation for change for these folks were, I may not be able to close a sale in the US, but I will get good commission if I help my Asian and Middle East counterparts in helping close sales over there. And obviously we built up sales forces in in Asia, primarily in Thailand and China, and in the Middle Eastern countries that I was referring to. For the production people themselves who were producing the product, the motivation for change was a lot more complicated. In that it was very evident that we should not be producing product here in the US and shipping them to China and shipping them to Thailand and shipping them to Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. But the motivation for change for them was to help their Asian counterparts open up factories. We opened up 2 factories in just outside of Shanghai, and we opened up a light assembly facility for kit assembly in the United Arab Emirates. And so whilst jobs were going to be lost here in the United States, by assisting these individuals establishing factories there, at least we would have scale of production there. And for some period of time, production engineers and those kinds of folks would be able to ensure that they did have jobs. So very, very much more complex kind of change motivation for those individuals. Bottom line out of this story is 5 years later, we were about a $7.5 billion business. We had grown 2 to 3% here in the U.S. We had grown quite astronomically in Asia, in the Middle East, and ultimately we sold the business to Ingersoll Rand, as many of you may know, and I departed out of that experience and moved on to my next experience. But Rick's theme of a positive motivation for change, regardless of the industry that we're in, or whether we're in a U.S. domestic business or a multinational business, one has to delve in and find what that motivation for human behavioral change is going to be. A lot easier when there is real upside, growth and growth expansion, than when there's downside, like in the manufacturing situation where we lost jobs over here in the U.S. and shifted the jobs to Asia.
Thank you. Well, I have some more questions, but I think more importantly is questions that you might have for the panel. So if anybody has a question, what I'd like to ask you to do is, when I call on you, stand up, please, because I think everyone can hear. When you do that, tell us what your name is, and then ask your question, or direct the question to whom you want on the panel. Yes, sir.
J.P. LeCoeur, partner at Brandstone, and I'm curious to what degree, to anyone who wants to comment on it, rebranding or sort of rethinking the purpose of the company, why it exists, its messaging beyond its products and services plays a role, especially when you're integrating these companies together. It's a way to reset sort of the employees' expectations. What experiences have you seen in terms of rebranding? Did some of these mergers together, yours in particular, mentioned, involve rebranding as part of that effort to create the culture and reset expectations for everyone?
In our case, there's a lot of internal rebranding. I think our external story has remained the same because it's about transformation and value creation by bringing technology into a very traditional marketplace, and that hasn't changed a lot. Within Mondi, our initial premise was that we could leave the operating companies as is. In fact, they were sold a premise that said, you just keep doing what you're doing, you'll provide the cash, and magic will happen through the wonders of science. And it was good. It sounded good at the time.
And they believe you.
Unfortunately, what happened is somewhere between 40 and 50% of our net revenue, of our margins, went away. I mentioned when I was giving my introductory comments that our value to the airlines is filling seats that would otherwise go empty. Well, the what's called the load factors now, the percentage of seats that are occupied is at historical highs and has been for several years now. And so the airlines just don't need us as much. They're focused on yield. We tend to be lower yield, and it creates an issue. And a lot of cash is gone out, and so we need to generate cash. What's changed in our internal branding is, instead of just being magical technology transformation, we're becoming process transformation as well. It's a new paradigm and a new modern way of doing business that leverages the best operational technologies as well as the hardcore science and the software that's going to transform things. So we introduced a whole element of centralization of our mid and back office functions, and we're in the process of doing that. We actually created that as a priority that is coming first and supersedes the technology transformation that follows. The idea is strengthen the foundation that you're going to build the house on. And it's a real struggle after a couple of years of going down this other path. to now have to reset and move forward. It's a lot easier if you pursue that at the outset. So it's a lot of selling. It's all the stuff that Rick and Daron have been talking about in terms of personal selling and making it a personal positive benefit for the people who are involved. But it is now gaining traction in really significant ways.
Any other comments on branding or rebranding? Other questions? Lisa?
Nobody discussed severance or compensation or any of those issues, so I assume everybody was happy and everybody stayed, but I'm sure that didn't happen. Did you structure separation packages? Did you offer people early retirements or leave packages? How did anybody want to talk about that HR stuff in there that didn't work so well?
While people contemplate the answer, I would like, Lisa, you didn't introduce yourself, so could you stand and let everyone know?
Sorry, I'm Lisa Yarnell. I'm currently the CEO of a private equity-backed hair care, personal care products business called Continental Consumer Products. Brands we have are mostly in the branded under Salon Graphics. It's the name, they sell mass market. Walgreens, Target, CVS.
Thank you. Lisa is also the founder of the CEO Leadership Series, so thank you. Anyway,
I'm old enough to be a founder.
I would just comment briefly, Lisa, in the example I gave at the outset about this technology company that acquired another business. With these very disparate sales forces, you may well imagine that the sales compensation structure for these two sales forces were dramatically different. The East Coast guys had a small base and a big bonus, and the West Coast guys, maybe commensurate with their culture, had a much larger base and not as large a bonus. And obviously when you're merging these groups together, you've got to harmonize their compensation. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, human nature doesn't permit us to make some of those changes as rapidly as we'd like, because we'd cause people to pick up their bags and go elsewhere. So we put in place at the time we conceived it to be a 2-year plan. It will be about a 2.5-year plan of harmonization of compensation for the salespeople. So this is the second full year of that harmonization. That means that there's still disparity in base compensation for certain levels of salespeople, but there's a lot less disparity in terms of bonus. And I'd imagine as we get into 2015 sales compensation planning that we'll completely have harmonized that. On the severance side, as I mentioned, a number of people had the privilege of going to work elsewhere. This is a business that were two owner-founder businesses. They treated their employees with dignity and respect, and people were rewarded for moving on, even though they were asked to move on. Where severance didn't have to be given, we still gave 3-month severance, and we did a lot of things to help these people, particularly they were back office people, HR, finance, IT, and those kinds of people to go get jobs elsewhere. And